section up here. First, the wind category. So I'll start off by saying this weather information, it's not super important that it needs to be 100% accurate. The wind, we use the Beaufort scale, which is a 1 through 4, but for you guys, if you just want to write in what your estimate is for the miles per hour, if you know what it was supposed to be that day, you can write that. The big thing is with wind is we don't want to do surveys when it's over 12 miles per hour. That's our cutoff usually. That's when it's windy enough where the birds aren't going to be singing and responsive to playback. For CC stands for cloud cover. We estimate that as a percent. So if you look up in the sky, and 10% of the sky is covered by clouds, so you write a 10. So on and so forth. Temperature, you can just either do your best guess, or if you have like a weather app on your phone, just write what it was. It doesn't need to be super accurate. It doesn't really affect the data at all. For transect ID, this is going to be the name of each point on your GPS. So how it works is it should be a 6 to 7 digit number, where the first 2 to 3 digits, I think it's between 0 or 1 and 104, how many transects there are, is or clusters. It should refer to the cluster. The next 2 digits would refer to the transect. So I plotted 104 clusters. Each of those clusters has 2 transects. So this is either going to be a 1 or 2, and then the last numbers are refer to the points. So it's either going to be a 1, 2, or a 3. So it's pretty easy. Just know what point you are and put that in the point spot. So it's going to be the last number of the GPS point is what point on the transect you're at. So, and I don't think there's dashes on the actual numbers that will be on your GPSs. So I think it would just be, without the dashes, take out the dashes. And then in the observer, you can either write your full name or you can write, we use, for my crew and me, we used our 3 letters of our name. So, we used our first initial, our middle initial, and our last name.
Let's have these guys use their full names.
Okay, full names is fine. The only thing is I'll show you that. Any questions about the top section? Pretty standard. Okay. So once you have that information filled out, you're going to start your point count, right? So you start out with a 3-minute point count. So set a timer or look at your watch and know what time it is. And, for 3 minutes, you're going to record every species you hear or see. And how we do that is, let's say you heard a ash-throated flycatcher, you would write that in the species box, and you heard it at what you estimate is 70 meters. You would put a tick mark in the 50 to 100 spot. It's between 50 and 100 meters. If you heard it greater, you would put a tick mark there. If you heard it within 50, you put a tick mark there. You only put it, so let's say you hear an ash-throated flycatcher, right, at 25 meters. You put a tick mark here, and then you end up seeing that ash-throated flycatcher. You wouldn't add a tick mark to the visual section. And only one tick mark. It just represents how you first detected that bird. That makes sense? So if you hear a bunch of lark buntings, you would just estimate how many you hear here. If you eventually see them, don't start adding tick marks to the visual, unless you end up seeing more than what you thought you heard. Are you guys familiar with AOU codes? So it's,
The 4-letter banding codes,
yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes, they should be familiar with them.
So it's usually the first 2 letters of the species, first name, and the first 2 letters of the last name, so like Bendire Thrasher, Beth. If you don't know an AOU code for something, sometimes you're not sure, and there's some weird ones out there. Just either put it in the notes here, or just down here, like if you saw a tree swallow and you don't know what a tree swallow is, you could just put whatever you put for the code and put it down here and then write tree swallow next to it or something. Just make sure so I know what you're talking about. Get familiar, obviously, with the MIMID AOU codes. They're all pretty easy, though. They're all standard. None of them are weird. So northern mockingbird, nomo, bat, and sap, and all those ones. Just get familiar with those, because we don't want to get confused by what anyone writes in the mimic section.
Also, if you have the iBird app, they're actually in there.
Yeah.
So you're saying if we detect an auditory and then we see it, we don't change, we would change it in that one?
No, so the only time you would change, so if you think you heard like 2 birds, right? But then you see them and there's 3 of them, then you would add a tick to the visual because there's one more than what you thought you heard. But don't add 3 to the visual. So, no, just how you first detected it, not both ways you detected it. So yeah, so for each tick mark in this whole line, we're counting that as an individual. So if you put a tick mark in both, then it's like you saw 2 birds when you only saw one. So just a tick mark in how you first detected it. Fly is obviously if they just flew over and didn't stop. So just tick marks for that too.
So Cody, you're treating fly as like a distance?
We just don't estimate distance for the fly.
That's what I'm saying, it's like
its
a
own
distance
thing.
measurement. Okay.
So, I mean, that's a lot of times like hawks and stuff, they're just soaring above. I don't want you to try and estimate how high a hawk is flying or something. Now, if any time during the point count, this is just the first 3 minutes of the survey, you detect a thrasher or a mockingbird, you don't put it up here. You put it in this section down here, okay? So let's say you detected, you're in like a minute into your point count, right? And there's a mockingbird. So you put nomo here. You want to estimate an exact distance and bearing. So it's important that everyone has at least something that can give you a bearing. I know some smartphones can do it, but also if you have a compass, or if, I don't know if you guys can check out compasses.
Yes, I have compasses that people can check out.
So yeah, if you know how to just get a bearing to the bird, to where you first detected it, and a distance to where you first detected it. Song question mark is just asking if it was, you detected it because it was singing, or if it's singing, actively singing. Just gives us an idea that there might be a territory there for that species. This is whatever period you detected it in, so if you got that no-mo during your point count, you would just put an X there.
Yeah, but the song, is that just a no or yes?
Yeah, just yes or no. Just Y. Just put a Y if they were, and if they weren't singing. But each line is its own. So it's a little different than up here. Each line is its own bird. So for every mockingbird you get, you would put it in line. For anything you get, it goes on its own line because it gets its own distance and its own bearing. Then just take some notes if it's doing any kind of behavior. Sometimes they'll be collecting nesting material or foraging or, acting aggressive towards other birds, anything like that. The more notes, the better. Sorry about that. I should have said that. So on the top for the all species area, not the mimids, we just put them into bands. So we put them into bands of 0 to 50 meters, 50 to 100, and then greater than 100. But for mimids, we want to get actual distances, and we want them, so last year we used rangefinders. This year, I'm just going to trust that you guys just give me your best estimate that you can. So as close as you can estimate it to the best of your
That's how
ability.
you IDA protocol. But it's formatted different, but this is the same length and distances that we use for IDA.
On the song there, do you want us to differentiate, is calling and singing both? Do you want those to be going in that?
Just singing.
Just
Because
singing.
it just tells us that there's a male. And then, so that's for the point count. Obviously, there's this section right here that says playback. So if you're still detecting that same mimic during the playback, just put an X. So like, once you start playback, that mockingbird that you saw might come in closer, you might still be detecting it, or it might go away. So just, if you get it during that first period, X, and I'll go over the playbacks in a second, but just know that here you're just putting X's if you're still detecting that same bird. If you get a Bendire during the point count, it's also going to go in this section up here. Okay?
And
also just want to put a note here in this video that I will have a separate video on how, that I will post on the website, on how to get bearing from a compass, what that means. It's the degrees. So I have a separate video on how to do that.
That'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, so any questions about the point count before I move into the playback? Yeah.
Yeah, what column point count? Would you expect, say, we saw paper or grasses, we put that in the same thing. And then you put an actual point count?
Yeah, so you know, occasionally you're not going to get a minute during, but we'll use your same stress, okay? If you got it during the point count, you put an X here, because you detected it first during that 3 minutes of silence. But occasionally, you're not going to detect them during your point counts, and once you start playback, they might pop up, and now you're detecting it. So that's why I have these categories. So you might not get it during the point count, in which case you wouldn't put an X here, but then you first detected them during the first round of playback, so then you would put an X there. But yeah, so just keep, we want to know, like, first up, when you first detect them, so did you detect them just by, they were just happened to be singing when you got there, or did the playback bring them out, and did they come out to the play, responding to the playback? And then kind of by keeping tabs on them during the whole playback, we're also seeing, like, maybe you had them there during the point count, but as soon as you started the playback, they left because they were scared away by the playback. So by putting the X's in those categories, we're just kind of keeping tabs on what they were doing. So you just want to be able to keep track of all the minutes that you have at each point.
Okay, let me just go through that again, make sure I have it clear.
Yeah.
So we see that sage thrasher,
Uh-huh.
and say we hear it make a call.
Mhm.
So we put song, yes, we put Y right there,
Yeah,
under song.
listen, yeah.
And then we put an X in count point.
Point count.
Yeah, point count.
If it's during your point count.
Yeah, if it's during the point
Yeah,
count,
if it's during the point
we
count.
put an X right there.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then we do a playback, and during the first playback, we heard it again.
Yep.
So we put another X under
Yep.
playback 1.
Yep.
And then the same thing for playback 2
Yeah.
and 3.
Yep.
Okay.
But if you do the second round of playback and you don't see the sage thrasher, then you wouldn't put an X. Like, it's just keeping, and it's never really that hard. Like usually, so once we switch to the playback, obviously we don't care about any other species other than the midlands. That's all we care about is the mockingbirds and the thrashers. So if you only have, you're not gonna ever get like 7 or 8 minutes. So it's pretty easy to keep tabs on the individual birds. So we just want to make sure we're following them and knowing how they're reacting to the playback. If they're leaving, if they're staying, if they're singing.
So Cody, I have a question. So the column there that says point count before playback 1, is that for the entire point count, or is that like a period of silence before you do the playbacks?
It's for the entire point count. That entire
Okay,
point
so
count.
that's an indication that you detected a minute during the entire point
Yeah,
count.
during those entire 3 minutes.
And then the columns to the right of that are kind of a breakdown of the point count.
Yeah, of the playback.
Is that right?
Yeah. Cool.
Oh, I turned it off, I'm sorry.
Okay, so we've done our 3-minute point count and we're moving from one spot to the next spot. And we spot, do we record that and not indicate it as a point count?
So after you're done with this survey and you're moving to the next point, all we care about in the areas in between is if you hear or see a Bendire. And at the end of this, I'll talk about what to do if we would consider that an incidental, kind of not on a point. And there's a little bit of a different protocol if that happens, but I'll go over that.
Okay.
I'm going to say something. You were right to your point.
And you do 3 minutes of silence, 1 minute? I don't quite understand now. Now I'm confused with
Yeah.
what you meant by first 3 minutes record.
Okay. So,
You get to a point.
yes,
Just-
yes. Okay. I'll start you from the beginning, okay? So we've arrived at the first point, okay? We're going to fill out this top section. I went over. And then, so the survey is kind of broken up into 2 parts, the point count and the playback, okay? So we go straight into the point count. As soon as we fill out the top section, we go silent for 3 minutes. We're recording every species we see that entire time, okay? Once that is over, we'll go into the playback, which I'll go into next. I just want to make sure we're straight on the point.
Okay, I'm confused because usually we do like more than one playback at a point. We're only doing one playback.
No, we are doing multiple. So we do 1 point count. 1 3-minute point count.
Okay, yeah, what's happening, Cody, is we have labeled this differently
Uh-huh.
in our protocols,
Mhm.
where when we say point count, we mean the whole thing, the silent period
Okay.
plus the callbacks.
Well,
So
I'll
you're
refer
counting
to it
the
as
point
a
count.
silent period.
Okay, I think that would work a
Okay,
lot better
yeah.
for the multiple.
Yeah, okay.
But in between the calls, is there a silent period?
There is, yeah,
So
yeah.
that, and that goes in the actual
Mhm.
recording. Or that's.
No.
We're gonna treat point count, when he has point count there, we're gonna call that the period of silence. So he wants to know if you, right, that first 3 minutes of silence, did you detect the mimid during that first 3 minutes? And then also during during playback 1 and playback 2 and playback 3. So it's a mix of it's terms being used
Yeah,
differently.
yeah.
But, so we're gonna relabel point count to be silent period.
So the big thing to remember is just, when you get to that point, you're just do it for the first 3 minutes, you're recording every species. After you play a song for the first time, now you're just caring about mimics, okay? So silent for 3 minutes, and then after you play that first song, you just focus on the mimic species.
So even Bendire, if you see one,
Mhm.
in the silence,
Yeah,
it goes in the point count.
no, well, it goes in this mimic section.
It goes, yeah, but
Yeah,
it's actually
yeah.
it goes on the
Yeah,
point
yeah,
count
yeah,
section.
yeah. Okay. Now the playback, okay, so we've silenced for 3 minutes, we've recorded every species, now we're gonna start the playback. And so what we do now is we record the time that we're starting. And the playback lasts for a total of 4.5 minutes. So the playback end time, you can just calculate that afterwards if you want, or you can write it down, it's just the end of your survey. Now for this period, the MP3 file is going to do most of the work. So the MP3 file is already set up to go for 60 seconds, or go for 30 seconds of song, a Bendire song, and then 60 seconds of silence. You don't have to do anything once you press play. So it'll play, 30 seconds of song, 60 seconds of silence, and then start another 30 seconds of song. And I can play it right now for you guys on our playback devices. So this is once you would write down the start time and then you would press play, right? This is going to go on for 30 seconds. Okay, so that was 30 seconds. And now it's going to be silent for 60 seconds. So that whole 90-second period of the song, and now this 60 seconds of silence, are these intervals. So that's what these stand for. So interval 1 goes until the song starts again. Once that song starts again, that's the beginning of interval 2. Playback 1, 2, 3, that's what that is referring to. Any Bendires you detect during this period are going to go in this area. But mimics are still going to stay up here. That's the only difference. Because you're going to still detect more mimics during the playback. So during this time, you want to be, if anyone's done playback before or is not familiar, you want to be, scanning the whole area, looking for any type of movement. So they're not always, they typically respond by singing, but they're not always going to respond by singing. So just be looking around, looking for them moving around in bushes, reacting to the playback. And then once the new section, the new playback starts, you're just going to want to change the directions you're pointing. Our speakers point both directions, so I think actually your guys' these are what your speakers are doing. Oh no, they only point one. So just each period, you just want to face a different direction. Face a different direction. There's more directions than there are periods, but just.
So now it's, sorry.
Yeah, interval 2, just started when you started singing again. Like I said, it does all the work for you when it comes back. Now we're in that second period of silence. And just remember, during this, we're only focusing on mimics, okay? So you don't have to be worrying about any other birds. Just be scanning, looking for Bendires or curvebills or sage. Any questions about that? Mhm.
Record all that information about this that's going to install.
Mhm.
And then with X.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And an X in every period you detected over. Any other questions?
So for whatever Beths we do see during the playback, they'll end up both under MIMIDs and down below under.
So yeah, so once any Beth we detect in the first 3 minutes of silence is going to go here. Any Beth we detect once we start playback, which we know we write the start time and the end time when we start, is going to go down here. If you detect more than 3, you can put one up here.
But if we did detect it during point count initially, it'll already be up there.
Yeah, yeah.
And
then you can
so
just-
we need to continue to fill it in or not, or do we just go down there and not worry about it up above?
Just go down here, but note that it's detected during point count. In the note.
It'll show up as
Yeah.
detected during point count up above, but is it going to confuse your data if we don't mark an X on playback 1, 2, or 3?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, this is more about seeing how the other thrashers are going to react to Bendire's playback. All we care about with Bendires is that they're there, and we're going to come back and visit them a lot more times. So it doesn't really matter if they how they respond to their playback.
Good, we have another question.
Yeah.
We're looking at the data sheet here, and in that bottom section, the Beth playback survey section, you have 1, 2, and 3 to represent the intervals. What if there's more than one Bendire thrasher? Should they fill out 2 sheets? Have a note maybe, the fact there's a female, or like it seems to be a pair. Is it possible to have 2 males singing? I mean, I would think it'd be possible.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, I would just, add Bendires to the minute section. Add Bendires
So
to
put
the
it up
minute
above in the
section.
MIMID section, any additional Bendire thrashers detected during a survey.
Yeah, it was never an issue in Remington last year, but I couldn't see it happening.
Well, you're in the good territory now.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah. And now, okay, let's say we're done with our playback. Just here at the bottom, now that we're done with the survey, we just want to fill out these. If we detected a vet during the point count, yes or no? Did we detect one during the playback, yes or no? Before survey, maybe you detected one while you were walking there, just let us know, put it on the data sheet that you detected one before. And then I'll talk about it in a minute, but you put its code down here.
Yeah, if you say you detected one, usually put it in
Mhm.
TS.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, the question was to take UTM data points if you find an incidental Bendire thrasher.
And I'll talk about incidentals in a minute, because they're their own special thing. And then maybe between point 1 and point 2, or point 2 and point 3, you detected a vet. So we would just want to put that you detected one after the survey on that data sheet. And then obviously we want to put its name, which I'll talk about how we name them in a second, because that's important. But before we move on, does anyone have any other questions about this? So, we found a Beth, right? So we're going to keep our eyes on it. The way it kind of goes usually is if we find a Beth during our point count, kind of everything else goes out the window because we want to keep our focus on them. So, if we find one early on our point count, it's kind of going to disrupt things because we're going to want to make sure that we know where that Beth is and what's it doing. So we keep eyes on it. If it moves, then we're going to go to that spot where it was, where we first detected it, and we're going to take a point on our GPS. If you have the territory mapping sheet, and I'll go more in depth on the territory mapping sheet later, but if you find, you want to start that right then. If you find a Beth, just start filling out the top. If you don't, it's something you can fill out later. It's not the end of the world. But I would usually carry one with me if I'm going out. It's more optimistic to carry one with me. So we want to keep our eyes on it where it moves and follow it if it keeps moving a lot and taking GPS points at each of those perches it's landing on. We name all the Bendires so we can keep them separated when we're referencing them in the future. for how we named them last year and how we're going to do it this year, we use our first three initials of our name. We put underscore or dash, it doesn't matter. Some GPSs don't like underscores, so dashes are fine. Beth, and then dash and the number of the bets for the specific observer. So that sounds kind of confusing, but it's pretty easy. So for me, my initials are CTB. Okay, so let's say I found my second Beth of the year. I just was doing a transect and I saw my second Beth. I would name it CTB Beth 02. It's my second Beth, so it's 02. So that number would go up, the more Beths you find. Points are going to be named in a system that, so usually how we do it, we don't, this is a lot to enter in your GPS when you're out there in the field. So as long as you name the first point after this, after the name of the specific Beth, you can just name the rest 02, 03, 04, 05. Just saves you a lot of time. You're not sitting there on your GPS entering every single little digit. We can rename them later, but it's just so we know which points which Beth those points correspond to. So does the naming make sense?
And if you're not sure, I would just write the UTMs onto the data sheet.
Yeah, and I'll talk about the data sheet, but this is just for how to do it in your GPS. After you've observed the Beth for like 2 to 4 points, and this is if you found a Beth while on a transect, just get like 2 to 4 points and then move on to your next point on your transect. We want to do territory mapping. Last year we did it on the same day, but the issue we ran into is a lot of times, especially early on in the season, those Bendires are still migrating north. So by waiting a few days before we come back and territory map, it's safer to say that Beth is actually setting up a territory there than not just migrating. So just get a few points the first time you detect them. We'll come back and do it another time. If you're done with your transect, or it's an incidental detection, go ahead and get as many locations as you can in like 20 to 30 minutes. I set it at 10, it doesn't really matter. Sometimes it's hard to get multiple locations, and I'll talk more about the territory mapping later. This is just if you find one on a transect. And like I said, we return at least 3 days later. A week is preferable, and we at least territory map 2 different days, unless they're actively nesting, which you'll discover pretty quickly while you're mapping the territory. Their behavior usually gives it away. So this is the territory mapping data sheet. If everyone wants to look at that. It's a lot simpler than the other one. So just to fill out the top, this is where you put your Beth code. So it's those first 3 initials and then the number that goes after the word Beth. Like in the example I used before, it'd be CTB and then 02 on this side. You'd write the date you first observed it, which is usually going to be the first day you're filling out the sheet, unless you don't have one on you at the time. So just write the date that you first observed it, and then if you found it on a transect or near transect, write that here. If you found it incidentally, then you would write incidental here. So when we're doing the territory mapping, this date and time section, obviously you can just write the date for the day that you're doing it one time and then just keep track of the times. We usually don't want to be there territory mapping for more than 30 minutes. That's a long time to be sitting there harassing the birds. So try to get as many points as you can get in that amount of time and just record those times for each point. For the GPS code system, you've got 2 options. You can either, if you're taking the GPS points in your GPS, just write the code you wrote for it. So, like I said before, if you're just putting it as 01, 02, 03, write that. Or you can write the UTMs in here. It's just whatever you prefer. I like to put them in my GPS. But if you just want to read the UTMs each point, just do that. The notes section is just for any kind of behavior, whether it's singing, if you see it with a female, if it's acting aggressive towards other birds, foraging, etc., carrying food, carrying nesting material, just any kind of behaviors that it's doing. If it just sits on the perch and sings, just like that, or sits on the perch and stares at you, or whatever it does. and then just put those, your initials or your name in the service section. That's just in cases where maybe someone might find a bird, but they can't go back and territory map it, so it might be a different person that territory maps it each time it happened. Questions about that? Okay, so I made this little animation of what territory mapping looks like. So say you found the Bendires, right, and now we're returning to its territory to map it a few days later. Okay, the guy comes in, and you want to get eyes on the Bendires, preferably without having to use playback. So you go back there, and you might have to wait a little bit until you hear it singing, until you see it. In extreme cases, you might want to use it. You might take playback with you to get the Bendires to come out if you sit there for a long time and you're not getting any, you haven't detected it yet. And once you see it, you're going to sit there and watch it and wait till it moves. Okay, so eventually it's going to move, and you're going to go over to where it was, and you're going to take a GPS point at that spot and record it on that territory map sheet. So that would be point 1, or whatever point it might be. So if the first time you territory mapped, you only got 5 points, and this was your second time territory mapping it, that's 0.6 now. Okay, so that sheet's just going to help us keep track of how many points we have for that bird. Now you're watching the Bendires up there, and he's not moving. Okay, and it's been like 2 minutes, and he hasn't moved, and he's just sitting there. That's kind of where the flush thing comes in. Like I said, we only want to be there for 30 minutes, so we're going to use the flush technique where we're going to flush them to the next point. Okay, so you're going to walk over towards the Bendires till it flushes. This whole time you're keeping eyes on it. They're typically not hard to lose depending on how thick the vegetation is, but usually they're going to fly really low to the ground when they're heading to their next point, so they're hard to lose, but they'll usually pop right back up and start singing again. So now you walk over there, you've flushed in, you've gone to a different point. So now you're taking a GPS point there, okay? All the while keeping your eyes on him, making sure you know where he's going, filling out your data sheet. Now you're going to go over there, flush him in, and it just keeps going until you get those at least 10 points each time you visit. We want 20 points total. Now, one interesting thing or issue that comes up when territory mapping is we don't consider points. When we say that we want 20 individual points, that does not mean that you need to get the Bendires to land on 20 individual shrubs. But you might kind of seem like that when looking at it like this, but we count each visit to a point, each time he flies to a new area, that's a visit or a point. So if he flew back and landed here again, or flew back and landed there again, that's an additional point. Because they do that a lot. They'll use the same 5 perches. The really interesting thing, and why I believe that this technique is actually valid, is if the Bendire is here on this shrub, and I come at him from this direction and flush him, you think he would want to fly this way, away